All right, continuing on with the United States, when it comes to exporting media, there probably is no country that is quite the powerhouse that the United States is when it comes to media, including the film industry. The United States is just sending media content all over the world. So television is airing in almost all 200 countries across the world, and American radio is all over the world, and even newspapers. You can find USA Today, you can find the New York Times, you can find the Wall Street Journal, you can find those newspapers fairly regularly around the world. So the U.S. is a huge exporter. Now moving on to our southerly neighbor, Mexico. Mexico, very, very few imports of newspapers coming into Mexico. In part, that's because Mexico is producing so many newspapers, which we don't even know if people are reading in Mexico, as we established earlier in the class. And so the appetite for outside news, and you just don't find a lot of literacy amongst Mexicans of other languages. And so it's got to be Spanish, and the only Spanish-producing newspapers around are going to be Mexican. They're not going to be coming in from Spain. So they're reading Mexican newspapers in Mexico, we think. Now on to radio imports. There is a fair amount of radio imports that come in to Mexico from the United States. You do hear pop music, and some stations in Mexico are actually formatted according to American pop music. So you do have radio imports coming in. And that's even more the case. Excuse me, that's even more the case for television. Television is coming into Mexico from the United States. In the evenings, you can find whole swaths of programming from 7 o'clock till 10 o'clock. Might be continuous American programming. Sports is very big, American sports, and the NFL is particularly big in Mexico. Moving on to Mexico's exports, Mexican newspapers not exported to other countries. Radio exported, not really exported to other countries. TV, really the only thing that's exported is that telenovela that we talked about earlier, the soap opera that's done in Mexico and in other Latin American countries. Brazil and Mexico, the two biggest telenovela producers. Moving now to China. Now, as we address China, I want you to think in your mind about the United States, because they are very comparable, and yet our societies and cultures are so different. When we look at newspapers, for example, very few imports into China. We know that China does not tolerate any kind of Western influence that's going to, in the Chinese opinion, degrade the Chinese culture. And so they're not going to allow newspapers that are salacious, that are sensational coming into their country. And you just don't find English-speaking or really many foreign newspapers in China at all. Same with radio. We've already established that China is not a big radio listening country to begin with, and you just do not find radio programming coming into China from other countries. There's a little bit. You've got a little bit of some of these international news services like the German Deutsche Welle. But when you listen to Chinese radio, you're not going to hear American artists. You're not going to hear British artists. Television, same thing. I mean, in part of what's at stake, what's controlling these imports here is you cannot be a foreign country that owns property, and you cannot be a foreign country that owns a media property in China. It's just illegal. You can in Ghana, you can in Lebanon, but you can't in China. So it's another barrier to foreign content coming in. When it comes to exports from China, here we have a different story. Though Chinese newspapers are very difficult to find around the world, radio exports are fairly easy to find in neighboring Asian countries, mostly Korea and Vietnam. And then also television, there is a fair amount of Chinese television that is exported when it comes to the CCTV channel, that's channel 9, China Central Television, Channel 9, that's developed for the outside world. Even here in Pennsylvania, isn't it not amazing that you can't get hardly any other programming from around the world, but there is CCTV 9 that is available on your cable station. Yeah, check it out. You can find Chinese television. So that's the Chinese government really funding and making sure that their television content, and particularly news about China and upcoming China and good news about China, is circulating around the world. So I'll return to that idea between, well, no, I would like to cover it now. Why is that the United States and China are similar? I mean, China has a communist ideology that has a stranglehold on freedom of information. The United States has has a capitalist ideology based in libertarianism, and it allows for free information, but advertising is what gets in there, and advertising is what is blocking a lot of the foreign media content coming in, because advertisers don't want to pay for advertising time alongside media content that is going to have a tiny audience that is interested only in French foreign films, or that is interested in Swedish hardcore heavy metal music. You're not going to find an advertiser that's going to be interested in that when they can have bigger audiences. So ironically, the freedom of the American system and capitalism, and the freeing up of being able to sell time and sell space in a newspaper so that you can pay for your media content, it ends up creating exactly the same kind of isolationist, ethnocentric, if you will, media import-export behavior as China. Exactly the same. They're both very insulated societies. All right, so let's move on to our final two countries. We've got Ghana here. In all parts of Ghana, it's very difficult to find any foreign newspapers, and in many cases, newspapers at all. As we've discussed earlier, Ghana is just very undeveloped, and there are many parts of Ghana where people do not write, so they can't read. They have no written version of their language. It doesn't exist. They can only speak orally. So you don't not only find not many Ghanaian newspapers, but you don't find imports. Radio imports, there is a lot of radio importing that comes into Ghana. You've got 3 stations that are not even Ghanaian that are in Ghana. You got the BBC, you got Radio France, and you've got Sky Broadcasting. They're all located inside of Ghana and then broadcasting foreign content inside of the country. Television imports into Ghana, it is also very common to see TV imports coming into Ghana. The reason for that is because Ghana can't pay for 24 hours worth of its own programming. It doesn't have the resources to be able to do that. So what it has to do is it has to import from Nigeria and from other surrounding countries. And you see a lot of music videos, for example, coming in from Nigeria. And that's content that's helping fill the schedule on the TV schedule, because Ghana can't afford to produce its own programming. When it comes to exports, very difficult to find Ghanaian newspapers outside of Ghana, right? You can't find them in Ghana. It's going to be hard to find them outside of Ghana. And same with Ghanaian radio. There's not a lot of radio that spills over into other countries. If you remember back from Chapter 4, Ghana is actually surrounded by 3 French-speaking countries, so it doesn't have a natural border country that's going to be open to English-produced music in Ghana. And when it comes to television, Ghanaian television isn't even itself sustaining itself 24 hours a day, so being able to export is not really something that it's been able to ramp up to be able to do yet. Moving to Lebanon now, our final country, we'll find many of the same features here with Lebanon, but we will find many foreign newspapers in Lebanon, and the reason for that is because Lebanon has a history of being colonized and being in the way of countries going to invading other countries, because it's that doorstep to Asia in the Mediterranean. And so because of that, you have a lot of transient people that came through, and they established homes, and they established culture, and they established media properties. And so you have a lot of foreign newspapers, even produced inside of Lebanon from other countries, that are available widely in bookshops and kiosks and other places. Radio imports, it's a small country, so it's going to be susceptible to all the radio programming that goes on around it. You know, Iran, Syria, even Syrian radio, it's a little bit far from Lebanon. Anything around Lebanon is coming into that small, very small country that you can drive from one side to the other at the smallest place in half an hour. When it comes to TV imports, again, a very poor country, hard to produce its own TV content, so it's importing a lot of content from other parts of the world. And then when it comes to exports for Lebanon, newspaper exports do go to other parts of the Arab-speaking world. Lebanon is looked at as a kind of a think tank, and especially as a place where you can find the clash between Muslim and Christian ideas. So there is an interest in that in other countries. And also Lebanese people are traveling to other parts of the Middle East, so the newspapers are following them. When it comes to radio, same thing. It can be readily received in Syria, Israel, the Palestinian territories are all within the radio signal range of Lebanon. Radio knows no physical boundary. Well, it does know physical boundaries in terms of a mountain, but it doesn't know a country's border. The signal just passes right over. And then finally, when it comes to television, it is common to see Lebanese television programs in other parts of the Middle East region, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen, all being examples where you can find, again, Lebanese TV programming. So how do we wrap up? Well, there's a chart that you can take a look at on page 326. It wraps up very neatly for all of the different media how each country breaks down in terms of whether it's a world-centric country or an ethnocentric country or an exocentric country. And when we just total it all up, we find that the countries that have the most world-centricism, if we can say it that way, that's going to be France. That's going to be France. And that's really the most world-centric country we have in the book. The UK is also somewhat world-centric, but the most ethnocentric countries, the countries that are most consumed with themselves and not bringing in outside influences are the United States and China. So that's going to wrap up our chapter on media imports and exports. Have a great day.